Welcome back, all of you. It's a pleasure to see the whole group. George, are you with us?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, there you are. Good. So what we're going to do now is take 45 minutes or so just to have a general discussion about any of the issues that came up, any of the questions that went unanswered, any comments anyone wants to make. Please continue to send us your questions from via the chat room if you're out there listening. There's a slight delay in getting them, but they will all come through, and I will make every effort to make sure that they get asked. I had a couple of things to mention just before we get going. One is, if you've never seen Huey Long in action, go on our lib guide, our library guide that Hannah Goodall at the Roger Williams University Library very skillfully set up for us. And it has some film clips, also some interviews with Robert Penn Warren. But I particularly recommend the Huey Long film clips. They're very short. And as someone said to me today, he sounds like Elizabeth Warren with a Southern accent. It's amazing what his ideas on income redistribution were, how far he was ahead of his time. And he also tells a very good story about the difference between Republicans and Democrats. I also, just to follow up on something we talked about yesterday, Alex, someone asked you if you could think of any films that were as good as the book that they had been based on was good. And I racked my brain and to try and come up with one as well. And of course, I thought of one as soon as we were off the air, and that is The Leopard, Giuseppe di Lampedusa's great novel. It was published in 1958, but it's in a sense the last of the great 19th century European novels. And the Visconti film he made of it with Burt Lancaster, I think I don't know if you agree with me, but I think they're both superb examples of their genre. And I don't know if you came up with any others, but.
Yes, and I think, first of all, yes, I think they are both magnificent. And I think, and when you brought that example up, the next thing I thought about was Lolita, not because the film is better, but because one of the conversations we could have about this is the distinction between those books whose authors are part of the cinematic process and those that are not. And obviously, if you don't live long enough to see cinema, then you're not in the game. And there's a whole different conversation to be had about Shakespeare, for instance. But Nabokov was part of that process, and so I think and J.K. Rowling was on set all the time, and there are authors who are there and authors who wish never to be there because they are completely different sets of engagements. And so I think that's a sort of parallel conversation that we could have is that, because we'll never come to any stability about whether the film holds up to the book, because it's a matter of opinion. But I am always very curious about the conversations that happen when authors either give permission to a screenwriter or a director to go and do whatever you'd like to do, and then those who either insist or the demand is put on them to be there and be part of the process in different ways. And so I think that just becomes another set of ingredients to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to change the subject quite drastically, I have a trivia question for you, which will pull us perhaps back into politics. Who was the third woman to serve in the US Senate? Does anyone know? It wasn't Margaret Chase Smith, if any of you are from Maine. She was the seventh, actually. The third woman was Huey Long's wife, Rose McConnell Long. She filled his unexpired term after his assassination. And she was totally different from Mrs. Stark in the film. She was a very activist woman. She came from Indiana, and she served for the 1936-37 Senate term to fill it. And she was offered, I think, another chance, but she decided she had enough of politics. So I just throw that out as one more little piece of the fascinating Huey Long saga. I want to start our major discussion today with a quote from a novelist, George Eliot, and ask you what you think of it and if it has any relevance to what we're trying to cover today. And she wrote at some point, the important work of moving the world forward does not wait to be done by perfect men. The important work of moving the world forward does not wait to be done by perfect men. And I invite anyone who wants to jump in to go right ahead, please.
You know, one thing that I would say is to remind us that Warren, whenever he was asked, is Willie Stark Huey Long, Warren would say, no, he's Willie Stark. Mm-hmm. Warren did not intend a one-to-one correspondence, even though there's obviously influence there. And, you know, we do see it in the novel in that Willie Stark does a lot of good. And he's not a character who comes across as being 100% terrible evil, but he does possess the seeds of his own destruction. And he destroys himself much more, I think, than others destroy him.
I always think of Willie Stark as resembling Long during his term as governor, and I think that Long's career took a very dark turn once he went to the Senate, and I think this later dark turn into things like associations with people like Father Coughlin, or I think that oh my God, who is the famous anti-Semite who spoke at his funeral? I'm forgetting the name of it. I think this dark turn is a later stage of Long's career, but I think that Stark is pretty close to Long until the moment he went to the Senate.
Interesting. Anyone else?
Well, you know, national politics is a very interesting game. I've seen a lot of these guys come up there and ladies come up to DC and they're seduced, or they become addicted to the bright lights. And Long, you know, generally a hustler like Long, charismatic leaders are attracted to other charismatic leaders, and there's a psychology behind all of that. And so a guy like Long would be fascinated by Father Coughlin. How can he get those crowds? What can I learn from him? Yeah. And what can I emulate from him? And a guy like, I've seen it happen over and over again when people come up from to DC and they see the White House and the bright lights and the power of the United States, and they become totally seduced by the whole. Yeah. And I think that's part of what happened to Long. Yeah. I think the idea of becoming president was sort of like, hey, I could live in that house. Yeah. I'm not joking about that. Yeah. It happens, you know.
Gerald L.K. Smith, that's the name I was trying to think of that I hung fire for.
Well
done. I think that Warren was very eager not to be taken as a partisan of Long, or as and that's why he wished to insist that Huey was not Willie, but Huey is very obviously Willie. I mean, I think he's the only person in the world who ever expected to believe the claim.
Right. A somewhat related question just came in. Is the negative take that we seem to have on Willie the result of conflating Hitler, Long, and Trump?
I don't have a negative take on Willie at all. I think he's an extremely sympathetic character. And I also think that you know, one of the differences between the 1949 novel, I mean, the 1949 film and the 46 novel is precisely that the film pushes Willie very much in the direction of Hitler. But the novel really is describing a populist figure, not a totalitarian figure. And I think that the novel endorses almost every policy that Willie stands for. It doesn't stand for his means. It doesn't stand for his personality. It doesn't stand for how it works out. But almost all the things Willie wants are things that the novel treats highly sympathetically.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that, but what I would qualify it with is that what Warren does is from his personal relationships to within the political sphere, within his family, and so on. What he does is destroy himself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. I was thinking one way to encapsulate the difference is that in the film, when Willie is dying and he says it could have been different, he means we could have had the world. but in the novel, when Willie says it could have been different, Jack, what he means is, man, I really messed it up here, and I could have turned this differently, given all I wanted to do.
So if I can ask a question of everyone else on the panel, what do you think, because John, I absolutely agree that it is in the nature of classical Hollywood cinema to reduce and to streamline and to make the kinds of choices about what happens in an hour and a half that you don't have to, those choices don't have to be made in 600 pages. So I'm wondering whether, it is not just the necessities of moving something from the page to the screen, but also the extraordinary shifts in the things that happened in the world between the time the book comes out and the time that the film starts to roll forwards. And I was wondering if anybody here could also speak to that.
I'm waiting for you, Ernest.
Well, I mean, I see the novel very much as being influenced by World War II, as I mentioned in my talk. And when we have that passage on, we don't know whether knowledge will save us or destroy us, I related it to, for instance, the atomic bomb. But I think you can also relate it again to the characters of Willie Stark. I think you can relate it to the characters of Jack Burton, as well as to the character of Anne Stanton. It's when Jack changes the picture in her head about who her family was, who were the people that she admired so much, who they were, that Anne enters into the relationship with Willie. So I think the novel is much more interior.
I'm wondering if the totalitarian paradigm behind the novel isn't Hitler but Stalin. And I'm thinking the difference is that Warren, like Ellison, is writing in an era when people have been burned by political commitments they made in the 30s. And lots of American intellectuals were highly sympathetic to Stalin. And by the end of the 40s, it was clear that was a really bad bet and they had something to atone for. And that's written all over Invisible Man.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why it is that the political program that Willie represents is so sympathetic, that he wants to describe how you can be taken advantage of by your own virtues and how you can be taken advantage of by the urgency with which you want to put those virtues to action. That's the great temptation for Warren is to when you're motivated by virtue to take the meat axe to things. That's why I think Willie is an example of Warren's higher law idealist, not an example of his dirty-handed pragmatist, that he's somebody who's willing to do anything for something that really matters. And the tragedy of the book is that it really is his virtues that make him bad, because he's willing to do anything to advance them. I don't think he really is chiefly a man who's after power. I think that like other characters in Warren, he's somebody who's driven mad by his own idea of the good. And
John
that's why that's why I think the romance of, I don't think that Warren himself had any romance with Stalin, but but lots of 30s intellectuals did. And I think that's part of the dynamic of now I am burned, now I am chastened, that novel ends with. It isn't that I want to give up those political commitments. It's that I've been chastened with how I embrace those political commitments by seeing how people who have been driven crazy by them behave.
Yeah, the relationship between Warren and Ellison is very interesting in that, Ellison in the 30s is writing for Communist Party newspapers. And no, he never joins the Communist Party, but he is very much a fellow traveler. Warren starts from another place. But by the time you get after World War II and into the 50s, they come together in many ways in terms of friendship and what they see as literature's role in the society and so on. And I think that very dynamic of the aftermath of World War II, the aftermath of Stalin, of the Red Scare, is what pushes them in that direction.
I had just about how to judge Willie. I just wanted to read a paragraph that I know is in the front of a lot of people's minds, and this is the paragraph that in the Ken Burns documentary about Huey Long, Robert Penn Warren himself reads it. It's the closing scene of that documentary, and the way Warren reads that passage just brings tears to my eyes. So I'm not going to read it like Warren, but I just wanted to hear it. And this is Jack talking about Lucy when Lucy says that I have to believe that this baby is Tom's baby. And then she says, yes, Lucy, you have to believe that. You have to believe that to live. I know that you must believe that, and I would not have you believe otherwise. It must be that way, and I understand the fact. For you see, Lucy, I must believe that too. I must believe that Willie Stark was a great man. What happened to his greatness is not the question. Perhaps he spilled it on the ground, the way you spill a liquid when the bottle breaks. Perhaps he piled up his greatness and burnt it in one great blaze in the dark like a bonfire. And then there wasn't anything but dark and the embers winking. Perhaps he could not tell his greatness from ungreatness and so mixed them together that what was adulterated was lost. But he had it. I must believe that. I think that's a shattering passage. For one thing,
sorry, go ahead.
For one thing, because it lays out all of the possible ways of reading Willie, but doesn't choose among them.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something George mentioned, which was the element of charisma, the charismatic political leader. He was talking about what happens to people who fall into that trap when they get into Washington or to Baton Rouge, wherever, or Austin. How would you define the charisma in this context, and how does it work? I'm thinking two things. That the real Huey Long did not look like much. I mean, he was short and pudgy, and you would have noticed him on the street. But once he opened his mouth, he had his audience mesmerized, and this worked on the radio as well as in public. What is it about a person that gives them that gift? And in Willie Stark's case, that enables him to pull these other people into his vortex, whether it's Anne, Jack, Sugar Boy, Sadie. They have all given up something of themselves because they're beguiled or mesmerized or trapped in his web in some way. How does that work? And is the modern world of media, is it still possible to do that?
You're asking me. In my experience, it's the ability to reach out and calibrate what it is that persuades people in a small group. It's an instinctive ability, and it comes from the hippocampus of your brain. And that I have seen this happen with some really great politicians. Bill Clinton could have a conversation with all of us here today, and we would all become captured by him. He would come back in 5 years, remember everyone's name, and pick up the conversation where we left off. It's an extraordinary ability. I've also seen that in certain trial lawyers who have photographic memories and who have the ability to literally crawl in a jury box and tell a story and persuade the jury of the righteousness of their cause. And it's an art. It's a trained and learned art, but it's also a gift of persuasion that attracts to certain kinds of people. Many people who are narcissists, who are self-involved, who are instinctively built to reach out and dominate the room. It's an animal ability to do it. And I look for, in fact, in politicians, we talk about, who's got the so-called mojo or not, who's good or not, and who's got the persuasive abilities. And it's an extraordinary gift to watch people do that. Bill Clinton collected people. Other people read books. He read people. And there are others like that too. Also, many master criminals have that ability, and con artists have it. Donald Trump has the ability. I'm telling you, rightly or wrongly, Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist who is a subject of many political psychologists. One of the things that I do these days is I work with some people who are profilers, and Trump is a sociopath and a serial criminal. Many politicians have the same characteristics. They just have a set of breaks before they break the law. But they're ruthless, manipulative, dominating people with veneers of facades of civilization on top of them. They don't show what they really think or feel. And so charisma is as charisma does. It all comes in all different packages. What Huey Long had, and I think that Warren emulated it, was the ability to reach out in an old-fashioned way and dominate a room and persuade most of the people in that room to follow him, to obtain followers, to deliver messages which were transcendent in many ways of the actual objective content. But the ultimate message was, I'm going to follow this guy. I'm going to follow this lady. I am becoming a follower. And I think that's kind of the practical meaning of charisma is it's applied. Now it happens in different ways. Some people are very good on television. Some people can reach through that television tube. Other people are better in a setting of a bandbox, of a small group dynamic to do it. And it just depends. A really good public official can do it all and can make that television work for them in some way. Anyway, that's my experience. It's a rather cynical experience because unfortunately, many people who have that skill sometimes lose their principles on the way, and they forget why it is that they got into the business in the first place. And you get continually disappointed if you expect them to be perfect. No one who makes change is perfect, and no politician. Walter Lippmann wrote once in a book called Public Opinion. He said, "Most great men lead lives of quiet fiction. No man is a hero to his valet." And I think that's true in politics.
Any of the rest of you want to jump in? Well, another question has come up, not totally unrelated. Ernest spoke of leaders who sow their own destruction. The listener would like to hear from you on any thoughts you have on that subject.
It's restraint.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have anything completely original to say on that. What I would say is I think something that marks Warren as a writer was his intelligence. You have writers, for instance, if we think of Faulkner was no doubt an intelligent person, but he had this emotional well to draw on, that he would write these tidal wave sentences that would take over the page. What you see with Warren constantly is that he brings up an idea that seems to be an answer to something, and then he undercuts it almost immediately and starts again and complicates it all the more. And I think we see that in many ways with the character of Willie Stark as he destroys himself in various different ways. In that what he does is he has in him this impulse for the good, and he seems to be going in one direction, but then what he does is give in to every negative impulse practically that he can have. So what Warren shows that is it's not an answer.
At what point did Willie Stark become corrupt?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think that what Warren uses is that he puts that doubt in the speaker's mind, in the reader's mind, in that when Willie does the wink, did he wink or did he not wink? Was he that naive or a bumpkin, or did he already have a plan?
Just to remind people that he winks at Jack Burton when the first time they meet, is that?
You're right, at Slade's drugstore in the back.
Yeah.
And he seems to be, the way he acts, he seems to be a simpleton, and they make fun of him for being a simpleton. Yeah. But Jack has the feeling, and Willie never never comes clean to him of whether he winked or not. And the feeling that I get reading the novel is that he certainly did.
Remember also that Tiny Duffy winks at Jack at the very end of the novel. He doesn't really wink at Jack, but Jack imagines that Tiny Duffy gave him a wink. Just when Jack is imagining that he's going to really lay it on him, he imagines Duffy giving him a wink that says, "Come on, are you really very different from me?"
Yeah. We know Jack is an unreliable narrator, though.
What was really trying to communicate with the wink?
Well, I'd like to say something about, go ahead. I'd like to say something about Jack as an unreliable narrator. I think every narrator is unreliable to some extent, but I don't think that Jack is an unreliable narrator in that he is trying to fool the reader. I think Jack is an unreliable narrator, like so many of Warren's narrators, is that it's impossible to understand the totality of things. And when the novel ends with that sentence, into history and out of history, and the what is it, the awful convulsion of time, what Warren is telling us is that the world is unsteady. Everything is unsteady. It's the summer of 1939 when that novel is ending. World War II is about to take off. There is no stability here.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that I think, goes on a grease shoot right into the movie, is that Jack's voiceover is what so many film noir voiceovers, what it is the the moral ambivalence of the world, and that unsteadiness comes right through. And it's in the voiceover, it's in the constitution of the mise en scène. If the film has to be simplified for the sake of the demands of classical Hollywood and the demands of mainstream entertainment, it gets recuperated in some ways by the complexity of the frame, and that you can read any image, just the way you can read the wink. Is it this or is it this? And if you look at it this time, and if you look at it again next week, you're going to see it very, very differently. And I think that's one of the reasons that Rawson starts the film the way he does, which is a way of you actually see Huey Long, with the torches behind him doing his stump speech at the very beginning. You have no idea what it is, but it is, as Freud says, the finding of an object is actually the refinding of an object. It's all there for you to think about in the back of your mind as everything else is going forward. And then there it is again. What do you think of it this time? And what do you think about it next time?
Somewhat related, does Cass Master question. Does Cass Master's guilt transform Jack Burton?
I'll take a stab at that. Cass Master's guilt opens up to him the idea that life is meaningful and life is deep. You have a story when you realize you have a problem you're never going to live down. And that's something that Jack has a hard time getting. I asked myself, what was it about Cass Master's story that Jack as a grad student didn't get? And I think that the story is that Jack as a grad student is a great debunker. His whole idea in life is, I'm going to find out the reason I don't have to take you seriously. Because if I had to take you seriously, that would be a rebuke to my self-hatred. And so he's always looking for the thing he can have on somebody so he can jeer at him and not have to take him seriously again. You'll notice that's how he characterizes people all the time. You know, the guy in the barber shop who says he, the people in the drugstore. He is a genius at little malicious insights into people. And as long as you can do that, you never have to imagine yourself rebuked. He can imagine himself. That's one of his ways of dissociating himself from what strikes him as his corrupt background. You know, his bad mommy, his weak daddy, his class privilege, all that stuff. And I think that he starts reading the Diary of Cass Master and looking to find a way to make a fool of him. You know, he's going to be like H.L. Mencken, or he's going to be like who's the guy who wrote Eminent Victorians? You know, who's really only writing a biography in order to jeer and sneer. And I think the thing that he can't get about Cass Mastern is that when Cass Mastern realizes that he's done something that he can never forgive himself for, that's the moment when he becomes a deep character, not a character whom you can dismiss. And it also is the moment when he becomes a character who finds commonality with other people, because commonality with other people is something you only find in Warren once you find a common complicity, a common shame that requires you to adopt moral generosity to other people. That's something that Jack has to learn the hard way. And I don't think he really understands it till after Willie is killed. I think there's another thing to say about the Cass Mastern story, and that is, remember the British edition didn't include the Cass Mastern story, and the movies don't include the Cass Mastern story, and Faulkner actually thought the Cass Mastern story was the only good thing about the novel. I think one important thing about the Cass Mastern story is not only that it lays out the moral framework of the story, the thing that Jack has to learn, but I also think the Cass Mastern story is centrally about race. But All the King's Men is mostly a novel about class, not about race. And I think part of the reason that the Cass Mastern story is in the novel so that Warren can say, listen, I'm a Southerner, I know about these things. The fact that I'm writing a novel that's mostly about class doesn't mean that I'm ignoring race. It means that I'm writing a novel that focuses on class.
I'm just picking up on that. Another question, ask for some comment on Warren's writing style and the influence of Southern culture and richness of language, et cetera, on that style.
Well, I think that Warren loved to talk. I didn't know him, but I've known many people who did know him, and they said he was a great storyteller and loved to talk. His daughter, Rosanna, tells me that he was incredibly gregarious and was always reciting poetry and telling jokes and had a great sense of humor. My old friend, R.W.B. Lewis, thought that Warren was just the best of company. So I think that came to him very naturally. And then it's almost a cliche to think that Southerners love to tell stories and love to tell narrative, but there's also truth to it. And I think one of the reasons that Warren wrote so much, and you look at how much he wrote and you think this guy never slept. You know, how is it possible to write 10 novels, 16 books of poetry, all these books of, these critical essays, edited all these textbooks? It seems impossible. But I think that it was just within him, and that he grew up in a culture that helped cultivate that.
Yes, anyone else? Well, another question, how does misunderstanding the past and the immorality of the past play into the book?
Go for it, John.
Well, there is a vision of the past that Warren doesn't want to embrace. He doesn't want to embrace, they were bad guys, we've learned how to be good. He also doesn't want to embrace, they were good guys and we haven't lived up to them. Warren's understanding of human nature is very Calvinist, or I would say very Hawthornian. All people are fallen, and all people's virtues and vices are so entangled with each other that it's very hard to tell where they pick up and where they leave off. And the first thing you have to know when you know people is that you're never going to get to the bottom of their story, and that you're going to have to face the fact that the complexity of their natures is part of their power. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of a figure like Lyndon Johnson. You know, half of Johnson's greatness had to do with the parts of Johnson that were unsavory too. Without that mix of dark and light in him, he could never have been an effective president. You know, had he been a Pollyanna-ish figure, he would have never gotten anywhere. Also, his ability to understand that you're not going to be able to do anything in politics without getting slightly dirty hands. I think that the thing that people, I think that Johnson understood his own complexity, and part of the reason he was a great president was that he was looking to atone for that. You must know the famous story. I think it's Roger Wilkins tells this story, where Wilkins asked Johnson late in life, you know, well, you had to play ball with Richard Russell. You had to grow up in a segregationist world. You had to get the approval of all those segregationists. You had to bait race with the best of them. How did you become the guy who passes the Voting Rights Act? And Johnson apparently said, son, now that I'm president, I'm free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Now, I don't know whether that story is apocryphal or not, but to me, it absolutely encapsulates everything that's great about Johnson.
George, is this apocryphal?
It's apocryphal.
Oh, dang!
You know, there are politics that Johnson grew up in. Y'all have to appreciate certain things. These guys, before he ascended to the White House, he never paid for an airplane. He never paid for a suit of clothes. He would go here to the KTVC radio station and sell ads. When he was majority leader of the United States Senate, he would call American Airlines and have them advertise at his local radio station, and on and on and on. Things that by today's standards, we would call enormously corrupt. John Conley, governor of Texas, who was a Johnson protege, always had an airplane supplied to him by the Brown and Root Company by George Brown. George Brown, you know, Johnson made George Brown a billionaire, and Johnson used George Brown at times, Brown and Root, like a piggy bank. And that was the era of politics, and they all did it, both parties. Cash was king.
Brown and Root was a drilling company, right?
It was all kinds of things. They were the main contractors in Vietnam, you know. It's now known as Kellogg Brown and Root. They're still today. They built all the buildings in Iraq for Bush. The nature of the business of big money and politics at that level is they were inseparable at that time. Johnson, however, was less of a crook than some of the others, and he was not a racist. Remember that he lost the Senate race to Coke Stevenson, and then he went on and he won one. And Coke Stevenson was an out-and-out segregationist, and that Johnson, such as they were, always had the support of minorities every time he ran in Texas, and it was the poor people. The establishment in Texas did not care for LBJ. The James A. Baker and his father and all the Houston, Dallas swells, they looked upon Johnson as sort of white trash, if you will. He was a little sleazy, a little, to put it mildly. But there were others, you know, new money players, Sid Richardson and some of the others, they took him in. Johnson made his peace with the oil and gas industry and the construction industry, and he had money to play with. They're all like that. Every political figure is always a blend of what we would call good and evil. And the nature of power is it's amoral. And if you want to read, you get a biblical injunction. These are the children of light and the children of darkness. And most of them are conflicted because they've got some of both in the same body. You know, and they're always fighting these tensions.
Perhaps related to this, a question, is Willie motivated by rejection in the sense that we think Trump is motivated by rejection?
Good question. He craves the approval. He craves approval. They all crave approval.
Yeah.
And certainly Willie's no different.
Well, when Jack is asked, what is Willie interested in? Is he interested in money? What is he interested in power? What is he interested in? Jack says, Willie is interested in Willie.
Right.
Good. One more political question that came up a little bit earlier and we didn't have time for, and it's to go back to George's survey of the Texan political scene now. This listener asked, is there tension between Mexican Americans who've lived here a long time in a place like Texas and the newcomers, the first generation?
I don't know, tension is the wrong, you know, there's an absorption factor. The first generation is Spanish speaking, second generation is bilingual. And there's not a resentment of the immigrants that you would think. But part of the reason is that the Catholic Church is very active, and that the first institution that immigrants see, other than ICE, is the Catholic Church. And the church is a wonderful socializing place. It's the social scene. It's the place where you get charity. It's the place where you can find jobs. It's an enormously powerful institution in Latino America, and I think it's where there's an acceptance. I think probably more than anything else of immigrants. Most second and third generation Mexican Americans are very sympathetic to immigrants coming to America, very much so. And not the mythology of they've taken my job and all that.
So.
No, it's the other way around.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll be running out of time in a few minutes, but I wanted to throw out one other general question to come up, and that is to each of you, what is your favorite political film other than the one we've been talking about?
I liked Primary Colors a lot. And everybody knows that Primary Colors is really closely based on All the King's Men, except Jack Burton is black in it.
I would have to say All the President's Men, largely because Carl Bernstein lived across the street from me for a while.
Actually, I have a better choice.
Yes, John.
There's a film called The Path to War, which was a made-for-TV movie about President Johnson's cabinet while they're fighting about whether to get into Vietnam. And I thought that movie really brought out the tragic side of Johnson's character. Johnson is played by Gambon, the guy who played Dumbledore. And I thought that movie really understood just the anguish that Johnson went through in that period when the Vietnam War is heating up.
Alex should be our pro here.
I want George to go first.
I don't really have a U.S. favorite. I've seen a lot of them and used to use them when I was teaching. There's a French movie called The Battle for Algiers. It's a classic.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That I used to use with my students that I like very much. And there's some other stuff, but you know, reality is so much more interesting in some ways, and that you know you couldn't. We are living in a period that you couldn't write a film about today. I mean, it's just you turn on all you have to do is turn on MSNBC, and it's just like, what next? You know, it's what next. And I look forward to somebody trying to capture the last 4 years with a really great. You know, I don't know that you can.
Yeah. Alex, I wanted to ask you a question. Um,
All right, I'm gonna put my film down, and then we can, then I absolutely want to hear that. I think it's Dr. Strangelove.
oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think mostly I feel like the films that move me politically or move me to think about politics are the ones that don't talk about politics overtly. So they are films like Johnny Guitar, or they're films like Giant, or Lone Star, or Do the Right Thing, which I think is probably the most overtly political of those films that I mentioned. But I think if there's one that really talks about politics, in the way that gets at, it makes absurd all of the things that George, I think you have lived your whole career seeing and shaping. It's how would you tell that story to the public? And I think in some ways that's how you get there, is to go that far beyond it, and to do it like that. But yes, John.
Well, there's two movies that I think are deeply in debt to all the King's Men that I just wanted to get your read on. One of them is Blaze, the Paul Newman movie about Earl Long,
Right.
and the other is The Last King of Scotland, which it really occurs to me that Forrest Whitaker is not playing Idi Amin; he's playing Willie Stark in that movie. And the Scottish doctor who's the protagonist of that movie is absolutely Jack Burton.
Yeah, and I would never have thought about that, and I did not think about that when I saw it. And as Charles and I were talking about yesterday, I probably haven't seen Blaze since it came out, so I would have to go and look at it again and think about that. But I think you're absolutely right, that is really a way to think about that film. And I think and this I think comes back to a question for George, is because you can see it in Trump, is his affection for other authoritarian rulers. That Trump fundamentally forgets he's president a lot of the time. He thinks he's king, and that is of course the anxiety that a whole lot of us have about what, whether the election goes one way or another, is what Trump will do with the results. But I think that's another conversation we could have, is the extent to which, every one of these figures is studying other figures, that came before and who coexist on the world stage with them, and think about them. So when you say that about the portrayal of Idi Amin as Stark, I absolutely would see that now that you've mentioned it. But I think that is something that perhaps, this is not a statement, it's absolutely a question, is it more inherent in the profiles of leaders who lean authoritarian to be looking around, as if looking around the Hollywood star system for other stars in the constellation?
I would commend you all. There's some literature, the work of Gerald Post. He was the former chief profiler for CIA. He has written about narcissism. And there's a psychologist named Haywood, his book is Tyrannical Minds. But the work of Post and his colleagues on profiling authoritarian dictators is sort of the seminal stuff. In my travels recently, reemergence in politics, I've befriended a number of political psychologists and psychiatrists, some of whom are clients, and you can see them on Twitter. These are I call them the crazy shrinks, and they're on Trump and analyzing him at every moment and so forth. Yeah, I mean, you can't make it up. Trump is capable of anything, and if he were to win by some weird chicanery, I think very bad things would happen to this country. I think Trump is capable of launching he is a sociopath. He is demented. He is suffering from cognitive decline, from a whole variety of things. And yes, he is capable of killing and of starting nuclear war. And I think you can see it if everyone will step back and understand what he means when he talks about the herd instinct with regard to COVID. He is perfectly prepared to kill another 200,000 people if he thinks it'll get him elected. And that's all he cares about. And he is a truly, truly evil person in a lot of ways that I just can't express enough of it. There are no redeeming values in Donald Trump. And if he's able to steal the election, I don't think he is. I think the country's onto him. And I think that the American people, there's a great wisdom in the American people. And you can fool them only so long, and then they wise up. And I think American people are wise to Trump. But it's very scary where we are now, guys. I'm not joking about this.
I agree.
Trust me, I have been to Libya. I've had clients in Syria. I have been to some very bad places. And this guy is in the same league with those guys. Same league.
I hope you're right. I live in DC, but I've been in rural West Virginia since mid-March in the pandemic. And one of the things out here that you see pretty often are these pictures of Rambo with Trump's head on, for the face. And it's not humor. It is gun rights. We will, what they perceive as strength, we will smash you, and so on. It's not something that's done tongue in cheek as humor.
We're not going. The Democrats are not going to carry West Virginia, but it's extremely scary. I mean, here's the President of the United States calling for the incarceration of the governor of Michigan last night.
Yeah, that was gross. Yeah.
And on the night before, he called for the incarceration of President Obama. Today, if you look at the media, at various flip on the tube, and you will see that the good old boys, the militias with arms, are basically standing in front of the Boogaloo boys are standing in front of the Michigan State Capitol.
Oh, great!
And providing security, and they want to arrest her. You know, I mean, he has unleashed the psychos in American politics, and it goes all the way. It's not only aimed at Biden; they're candidates for the state senate who are finding themselves tracked on the internet by these crazies, and it goes on and on and on, and it's going to take years to deal with it.
I just want to throw in one favorite. Sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say, to bring it back to Warren for just a moment. One thing that Warren always stresses is the importance of self-reflection and looking at yourself. For instance, his book on segregation, The Inner Conflict in the South, that he published it had started out as a series of articles in Life magazine, but how he ends that book is on questioning himself and his own motives. And that's something that we see someone like Trump being completely incapable of doing.
No, he can't do that.
Just to throw out one more film, Charlie Wilson's War, if I've got the title right. It's a story of how totally random and unpredictable and anything can go on. It's the way the world is run. So I will leave you with that. I am amid this talk of gloom and doom. I am encouraged by the phenomenon that the six of us can sit down here together and try to introduce some element of rationality into our interpretation of the real world and the fictive world. And it's been a wonderful 3 days. I want to really thank all of you. I know you have a lot of other things going on in your life. I appreciate your generosity in taking this time to be with us and to share with us your knowledge and your take on the times we live in. So we're going to, I'm going to turn this over now to my co-chair of BookFest, Joanna Ziegler, and she's going to talk for just a moment, and then we'll come back and I'll tell you what next year's book will be.
Thank you, Charles. My name is Jo Ziegler, and I have the honor of being the co-chair with Charles with our talented BookFest team of co-founders. Charles created Winter Weekend, an annual literary program based on the discussion of a great book. This event has been presented at Bowdoin College for over 20 years with great success. When Charles moved to Bristol a year and a half ago, he agreed to guide us to create a literary event for Bristol based on this model, an event to engage and bring together serious readers to discuss a great book. My thanks go to Charles for this great gift to our community and to our talented BookFest committee. They did the work and they kept the vision. I want to thank Betty Brito from the Rogers Free Library, Amy Vitale from Friends of the Library, Joan Abrams from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, Doug Popovich, Arts in Common, Elizabeth Labors from the Herreshoff Museum, and Rebecca Riley from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. I would also like to offer a special thanks to Doug Popovich and Amy Vitale. When our March live BookFest was postponed, they navigated us through the perils of presenting a virtual version of BookFest that we have enjoyed this weekend. I hope you have enjoyed your weekend with Robert Penn Warren, all the King's Men, and our great speakers. We will look for you next year at this time for BookFest 2021. And now I will turn it over to Charles. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'll just add that none of this would have happened without her. She's been the inspiration, the person who's held it all together. So at this point, I'll go ahead and announce the.
Yes.
I'll let the screen run down. Yes, October 2021. Please stay. Keep this date in mind. And the book we have chosen for next year is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's a very short book, but one that's had a long afterlife in all kinds of media. The program itself, we're envisioning as a very multidisciplinary event. It will have a literary element, talking about the Shelley Circle. Mary Shelley was the daughter of a famous and pioneering feminist. She was the wife of a great romantic poet. She was a friend of Lord Byron and many other interesting people, and she was an important writer in her own right. So we want to talk about that circle of writers and thinkers in the early 19th century. But we also want to take this book into the 21st century and beyond by talking about some of the many issues it raises, particularly in the fields of, for example, artificial intelligence, bioengineering, the human urge to pursue human perfectibility, and so forth and so on. So I think it's going to be a very rich and multifaceted program. And again, after I congratulate you on having read a 600-page book and coming here today. This is, I'm not quite sure how many pages, but you could almost read it in one sitting. So it'll be a different literary experience, but one I think you will find very rewarding. And I look forward to working with the same group as we go forward. And I wish you all a very pleasant, full evening from here in Bristol, Rhode Island. And thank you again for those wonderful speakers. You have just, you have made what we envisioned a reality, and I can't tell you how much that means to us.